Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 8. Betsy Starts a Sewing Society. Betsy and Molly had taken Deborah to school with them. Deborah was the old wooden doll with brown painted curls. She had lain in a trunk almost ever since Aunt Abigail's childhood, because Cousin Anne had never cared for dolls when she was a little girl. At first, Betsy had not dared to ask to see her, much less to play with her, but when Ellen, as she had promised, came over to the Putney farm, that first Saturday, she had said right out, as soon as she had landed in the house, "Oh, Mrs. Putney, can't we play with Deborah?" And Aunt Abigail had answered, "Why, yes, of course, and I knew there was something I've kept forgetting." She went up with them herself to the cold attic and opened the little hair trunk under the eaves. There lay a doll, flat on her back, looking up at them brightly out of her blue eyes. "Well, Debbie, dear," said Aunt Abigail, taking her up gently, "it's a good long time since you and I played under the lilac bushes, isn't it? I expect you've been pretty lonely up here all these years. Never mind, you'll have some good times again now." She pulled down the doll's full, ruffled skirt, straightened the lace at the neck of her dress, and held her for a moment, looking down at her silently. You could tell by the way she spoke, by the way she touched Deborah, by the way she looked at her, that she had loved the doll dearly, and maybe still did, a little. When she put Deborah into Betsy's arms, the child felt that she was receiving something precious, almost something alive. She and Ellen looked with delight at the yards and yards of picot-edged ribbon, sewed on by hand to the ruffles of the skirt, and lifted up the silk folds to admire the carefully made, full petticoats and frilly drawers, the pretty, soft old kid shoes, and white stockings. Aunt Abigail looked at them with an absent smile on her lips, as though she were living over old scenes. Finally, "It's too cold to play up here," she said, coming to herself with a long breath. "You'd better bring Deborah and the trunk down into the south room." She carried the doll, and Betsy and Ellen each took an end of the old trunk, no larger than a modern suitcase. They settled themselves on the big couch, back of the table with the lamp. Old Shep was on it, but Betsy coaxed him off by putting down some bones Cousin Anne had been saving for him. When he finished those and came back for the rest of his snooze, he found his place occupied by the little girls, sitting cross-legged, examining the contents of the trunk, all spread out around them. Shep sighed deeply, and sat down with his nose resting on the couch near Betsy's knee, following the movements with his kind, dark eyes. Once in a while, Betsy stopped hugging Deborah, or exclaiming over a new dress long enough to pat Shep's head and fondle his ears. That was what he was waiting for, and every time she did it, he wagged his tail thumpingly against the floor. After that, Deborah and her trunk were kept downstairs where Betsy could play with her. Often she was taken to school. You never heard of such a thing as taking a doll to school, did you? Well, I told you, this was a queer, old-fashioned school. As a matter of fact, it was not only Betsy who took her doll to school. All the little girls did, whenever they felt like it. Miss Benton, the teacher, had a shelf for them in the entryway where the wraps were hung, and the dolls sat on it and waited patiently all through the lessons. At recess time, or noon, each little mother snatched her own child and began to play. As soon as it grew warm enough to play outdoors without just racing around every minute to keep from freezing to death, the dolls and their mothers went out to a great pile of rocks at one end of the bare stony field, which was the playground. There they sat and played in the spring sunshine, warmer from day to day. There were a great many holes and shelves and pockets and little caves in the rocks, which made lovely places for playing keep house. Each little girl had her own particular cubbyholes and rooms, and they visited their dolls back and forth all around the pile. And as they played, they talked fast about all sorts of things, as they played ball, or duck on a rock, or prisoner's goal, racing and running and wrestling noisily all around the rocks. There was one child who neither played with the little girls, nor ran and whooped with the boys. This was little 6-year-old Lias, one of the 2 little boys in Molly's first grade. At recess time, he generally hung around the school door by himself, looking moodily down, and knocking the toe of his ragged, muddy shoe against a stone. The little girls were talking about him one day as they played.
"My, isn't that Lize Brewster the horridest-looking child?"
said Eliza, who had the second grade all to herself, although Molly now read out of the second reader with her.
"Mercy, yes,
so ragged," said Anastasia Monahan, called Stashie for short. She was a big girl, 14 years old, who was in the 7th grade.
"He doesn't look as if he ever combed his hair," said Betsy. "It looks just like a wisp of old hay. And sometimes," little
Molly proudly added her bit of talk to the other girls,
"he forgets to put on any stockings, and just has his dreadful old shoes over his dirty bare feet."
"I guess he hasn't got any stockings half the time," said Big Stashie scornfully. "I guess his stepfather drinks 'em up."
"How can he drink up stockings?"
asked Molly, opening her round eyes very wide.
"Shh! You mustn't ask. Little girls shouldn't know about such things. Should they, Betsy?"
"No, indeed," said Betsy, looking mysterious. As a matter of fact, she herself had no idea what Stashie meant, but she looked wise and said nothing. Some of the boys had squatted down near the rocks for a game of marbles now.
"Well, anyhow," said Molly resentfully, "I don't care what his stepfather does to his stockings. I wish 'Lias would wear 'em to school. And lots of times he hasn't anything on under those horrid old overalls either. I can see his bare skin through the torn places." "I wish he didn't have to sit so near me," said Betsy complainingly. "He's so dirty."
"Well, I don't want him near me either," cried all the other little girls at once. Ralph glanced up at them frowning, from where he knelt with his middle finger crooked behind a marble ready for a shot. He looked as he always did, rough and half-threatening. "You girls make me sick," he said. He sent his marble straight to the mark, pocketed his opponent's, and stood up, scowling at the little mothers.
"I guess if you had to live the way he does, you'd be dirty. Half the time he don't get anything to eat before he comes to school, and if my mother didn't put some extra for him in my box, he wouldn't get any lunch either. And then you go and jump on him."
"Why doesn't his own mother put up his lunch?" Betsy challenged their critic.
"He hasn't got any mother. She's dead," said Ralph, turning away with his hands in his pockets. He yelled to the boys, "Come on, fellers, beat you to the bridge and back," and was off, with the others racing at his heels. "Well, anyhow, I don't care. He is dirty and horrid," said Stashie emphatically, looking over at the drooping, battered little figure, leaning against the school door, listlessly kicking at a stone. But Betsy did not say anything more just then. The teacher, who boarded round, was staying at Putney Farm at that time, and that evening, as they all sat around the lamp in the south room, Betsy looked up from her game of checkers with Uncle Henry and asked, "How can anybody drink up stockings?" "Mercy, child, what are you talking about?" asked Aunt Abigail. Betsy repeated what Anastasia Monahan had said, and was flattered by the rather startled attention given her by the grown-ups. "I didn't know that Bud Walker had taken to drinking again," said Uncle Henry. "My, that's too bad." "Who takes care of that child, anyhow, now that poor Susie's dead?" Aunt Abigail asked of everybody in general. "Is he just living there alone, with that good-for-nothing stepfather? How do they get enough to eat?" said Cousin Anne, looking troubled. Apparently, Betsy's question had brought something half-forgotten and altogether neglected into their minds. They talked for some time about about 'Lias, the teacher confirming what Betsy and Stashie had said. "And we sitting right there with plenty to eat and never raising a hand," cried Aunt Abigail. "How you will let these things slip out of your minds," said Cousin Anne remorsefully. It struck Betsy vividly that 'Lias was not all the one they blamed for his objectionable appearance. She felt quite ashamed to go on with the other things she and the little girls had said, and fell silent, pretending to be very much absorbed in her game of checkers. "Do you know," said Aunt Abigail suddenly, as though an inspiration had just struck her, "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if that Elmore Pond might adopt 'Lias, as if he was gone at the right way." "Who's Elmore Pond?" asked the school-teacher. "Why, you must have seen him, that great, big, red-faced, good-natured-looking man that comes through here twice a year, buying stock. He lives over Digby way, but his wife was a Hillsborough girl, Matey Pelham. An awful nice girl she was, too. They never had any children, and Matey told me last time she was back for a visit that she and her husband talked quite often about adopting a little boy. Seems that Mr. Pond has always wanted a little boy. He's such a nice man. 'Twould be a lovely home for a child. But goodness, said the teacher, nobody would want to adopt such an awful-looking little ragamuffin as that Lias. He looks so mean, too. I guess his stepfather's real mean to him when he's been drinking, and it's got Lias so he hardly dares hold his head up. The clock struck loudly. Well, hear that, said Cousin Anne. 9 o'clock, and the children not in bed. Molly's most asleep this minute. Trot along with you, Betsy. Trot along, Molly. And, Betsy, be sure Molly's nightgown is buttoned up all the way. So it happened that though the grown-ups were evidently going to talk about Lias Brewster, Betsy heard no more of what they said. She herself went on thinking about Lias while she was undressing and answering absently little Molly's chatter. She was thinking about him even after they had gone to bed, had put the light out, and were lying snuggled up to each other, back to front, their 4 legs crooked at the same angle, fitting in together neatly like 2 spoons in a drawer. She was thinking about him when she woke up, and as soon as she could get hold of Cousin Anne, she poured out a new plan. She had never been afraid of Cousin Anne since that evening Molly had fallen into the wolf pit, and Betsy had seen the pleased smile on Cousin Anne's firm lips. Cousin Anne, couldn't we girls at school get together and sew? You'd have to help us some, and make some nice new clothes for little Lias Brewster, and fix him up so he'll look better, and maybe that Mr. Pond will like him and adopt him? Cousin Anne listened attentively and nodded her head. Yes, I think that would be a good idea, she said. We were thinking last night we ought to do something for him. If you'll make the clothes, Mother'll knit him some stockings, and Father will get him some shoes. Mr. Pond never makes his spring trip till late May, so we'll have plenty of time. Betsy was full of importance that day at school, and at recess time got the girls together on the rocks, and told them all about the plan. Cousin Anne says she'll help us, and we can meet at our house every Saturday afternoon till we get them done. It'll be fun. Aunt Abigail telephoned down to the store right away, and Mr. Wilkins says he'll give the cloth if we'll make it up. Betsy spoke very grandly of making it up, although she had hardly held a needle in her life, and when the Saturday afternoon meetings began, she was ashamed to see how much better Ellen, and even Eliza, could sew than she. To keep her end up, she was driven to practicing her stitches around the lamp in the evenings, with Aunt Abigail keeping an eye on her. Cousin Anne supervised the sewing on Saturday afternoons, and taught those of the little girls whose legs were long enough to know how to use the sewing machine. First, they made a little pair of trousers out of an old gray woolen skirt of Aunt Abigail's. This was for practice, before they cut into the piece of new blue serge that the storekeeper had sent up. Cousin Anne showed them how to pin the pattern on the goods that they each cut out one piece. Those flat, queer-shaped pieces of cloth certainly did look less like a pair of trousers to Betsy than anything she had ever seen. Then one of the girls read aloud very slowly the mysterious-sounding directions from the wrapper of the pattern about how to put the pieces together. Cousin Anne helped here a little, particularly just as they were going to put the sections together wrong side up. Stashie, as the oldest, did the first basting, putting the notches together carefully, just as they read the instructions aloud, and there, all of a sudden, was a rough little sketch of a pair of knee trousers, without any hem or any waistband, of course, but just the 2-legged, complicated shape they ought to be. It was like a miracle to Betsy. Cousin Anne helped them sew the seams on the machine, and they all turned to for the basting of the facings and the finishing. They each made 1 buttonhole. It was the first one Betsy had ever made, and when she got through she was tired, as though she had run all the way to school and back. Tired, but very proud, although when Cousin Anne inspected that buttonhole, she covered her face with her handkerchief for a minute, as though she were going to sneeze, although she didn't sneeze at all. It took them 2 Saturdays to finish up that trial pair of trousers, and when they showed the result to Aunt Abigail, she was delighted. "Well, to think of that being my old skirt," she said, putting on her spectacles to examine the work. She did not laugh either when she saw those buttonholes, but she got up hastily and went into the next room, where they soon heard her coughing.